We are living in historic times, and history is made in key moments where key difficult decisions are made. And we are facing one of those key historic moments. Books will be written about this. We will look back on this as one of the major turning points in our lives, and we don't know which way it's going to go. And what I'm talking about here is the question of whether or not the United States is going to take action against the regime, military action, fulfilling President Trump's threats, because things are getting very, very tight over there. There's a lot of pressure on President Trump from both sides. Let's run down what has happened in the last day. So yesterday, President Trump was on the road, and he spoke to reporters both on the tarmac near Air Force One and also in Detroit, where he was visiting some factories. So let's take a look at a couple of those clips right now, and then we'll talk about what it looks like President Trump will or will not do. So here's the first clip here. This is President Trump talking to a reporter on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base on his way to Detroit.
U.S. assets in the Middle East. What do you say to U.S. service members about why it is worth the risk to intervene in Iran?
Yeah, Iran said that the last time I blew them up with the nuclear capability, which they don't have any longer. So Iran said that the last time. They better behave.
So Iran said that the last time, meaning Iran said that they would retaliate. So he's dismissing the idea of Iran retaliating if America strikes. So that still seems to indicate, it sounds, the resolve in his voice sounds like he's still willing to carry out the airstrikes. And then he was talking to CBS News when he was visiting a factory in Detroit, and he was asked about what he meant when he would take strong action.
Americans woke up this morning and they saw that you said help is on the way.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a lot of help on the way, and in different forms, including economic help from our standpoint, and not going to help Iran very much. And, we put Iran out of business with their nuclear capacity, and now, depending on what's actually happening, nobody's been able to give us accurate numbers about how many people they've killed.
Well, on that point,
but it looks like it could be a pretty substantial number, and that's going to be a lot of problems for them.
A lot of problems. On that point, you did say the U.S. would get involved if Iran started killing protesters. Yeah. They have, by the many thousands, according to reports.
Well, we'll see what that is. I've heard two numbers, but we'll see what that is.
Well, now we're hearing that they're going to start hanging protesters tomorrow. So it comes back to the question, have they crossed your red line, or has the line moved?
I haven't heard about the hanging. If they hang them, you're going to see some things that I don't know what where you come from and what your thought process is, but you'll perhaps be very happy.
What do you mean by that?
We will take very strong action. If they do such a thing, we will take very strong action.
And this strong action you're talking about, what's the end game?
The end game is to win. I like winning.
How do you define that in Iran?
Well, let's define it in Venezuela. Let's define it with al-Baghdadi. He was wiped out. Let's define it with Soleimani. And let's define it in Iran, where he wiped out their Iran nuclear threat in a period of about 15 minutes once the B-2s got there. And that was a complete obliteration, as it turns out, which is what I said initially. Then some questioned it, and they said, Trump was right. So we've been right about everything. We don't want to see what's happening in Iran happen. And, if they want to have protests, that's one thing. When they start killing thousands of people, and now you're telling me about hanging, we'll see how that works out.
Okay, there's a lot to discuss when it comes to this particular clip. So before we move on to other clips and other sources, other updates, let's talk about what President Trump just said here, because I think it's huge. And kudos to the interviewer for asking him what he means by success. What is the end game of an attack in Iran? And President Trump said, of course, I like winning. He says, what do you mean by winning? What does winning look like? And then President Trump dropped what I believe is a huge signal about where he's going with this. He mentioned Venezuela first, and that, of course, is referring to the kidnapping and basically the decapitation of the regime, the removal of the top figure in the regime, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife. He referred to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. That was during Trump's first term. And, of course, the removal of al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS. So here he gives three examples of actual decapitation of top leadership as his definition of victory. And then he also added in the strikes against the Iranian nuclear facilities. That seems to be what's on his mind as examples of what might be done. Notice he did not mention at any point a desire or willingness to negotiate. And this is very significant because of the pushback that is happening right now within the Trump administration. Now, I mentioned in the update from yesterday that there was some pushback coming from Senator Rand Paul, but we also see pushback coming from some very close friends of the Trump administration. Breaking: Qatar refuses the U.S. to strike Iran from its soil and the U.S. military base from it. Qatar is essentially vetoing or trying to veto American operation against Iran. There's also a lot of indications that Saudi Arabia, there's been word that Saudi Arabia is opposed to the U.S. attacking and has signaled to the U.S. that it will be catastrophic if the U.S. attacks the Iranian regime. What does that mean, that it'll be catastrophic? And of course, there's J.D. Vance. So Wall Street Journal reported a couple days ago, aides led by U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance are advocating for diplomacy with the Islamic regime as a first step, with Vance publicly suggesting that a real negotiation on Iran's nuclear program could be the smartest path forward. So you have these forces that are aligned. Now, J.D. Vance is closely aligned with that circle around President Trump. He's part of that group around President Trump that is closely aligned with Qatar. And, he's very close with Tucker Carlson. He's very close with Trump's children, with Donald Trump Jr. in particular, who are much closer to that political side of the aisle within the Trump administration that is more amenable to this friendship and cooperation with the Qataris. Steve Witkoff, of course, is part of that, Trump's envoy to the Middle East. So there's a whole cadre of people around Trump who are kind of pushing for rapprochement of some sort, and certainly opposed to the United States taking any action against Iran, taking any military action. So there's a lot of pressure. It's coming again from the Qataris, from the Saudis, and here we have the Turks. Turkey warning the U.S. and Israel to stay out of Iran, and calls out Israel for fueling protesters. And this raises a very important question of why, because we've known for many years that the Qataris and the Saudis hate the Iranians. So why are they now trying to protect the regime? And look, bottom line is this: they hate the Iranians, but the last thing they want is a democratic, free society, a free, pro-Western, non-Islamic society in this massive, powerful country in the Middle East. They don't want that. They don't want democracy coming to their part of the world in a meaningful way, because that could lead to movements for democracy in their own countries. So even though they can't stand the mullahs in Tehran and they view them as a problem, the last thing they need is some kind of new type of Arab Spring or new type of, Middle Eastern revolutionary winds blowing, where people are trying to overthrow these Islamic dictatorships that aren't really democracies. So they're actually terrified of the Islamic regime falling. And certainly Turkey is opposed to this. They're trying to spread radical Islam across the Middle East. They certainly don't want the regime to fall. Now, at the same time, Reza Pahlavi, we've been talking about him a lot lately, the Crown Prince, has continued to put out messages of encouragement to the Iranian people. And here's one that he put out just yesterday. Let's take a look at this.
همانطور که در پیام قبلیم به شما گفتم، صدای شما و شجاعت شما را جهانیان نه تنها دیدن و شنیدن، بلکه دارن اکنون اقدام میکنن. قاعدتاً تا به حال بایستی پیام رئیس جمهور امریکا رو در ضمن شنیده باشید. کمک در راه هست. مبارزه را همطور که تا به حال انجام دادید ادامه میدید. نگذارید که این نظام شرایط رو عادی جلوه بکند. بعد از این همه کشتار اخیر، یک دریا خون بین ما و این رژیم هست. یادداشت کنید اسامی این جنایتکاران رو. یه روزی به سزای اعمالشون خواهند رسید. و اما پیام ویژه‌ای دارم به پرسنل ارتش. شما ارتش ملی ایران هستید، نه ارتش جمهوری اسلامی. وظیفه دارید از جان همیهنانتون حفاظت بکنید. فرصت زیادی براتون نمونده. به مردم هرچی زودتر بپیوندید.
So there, he of course started out by mentioning President Trump, by actually quoting him, "Help is on the way," and indicating that President Trump is with them and that the West has heard their calls. So he's tethering himself very closely to the statements that President Trump made earlier yesterday about how the Americans will take action on behalf of the Iranian people. But then he pivoted towards a direct call to members of the military to switch sides, a direct call to them to break ranks with the Islamic Republic and instead switch sides to protect the people. And we're seeing more and more of this. Here's a little video that came out the other day. This is an Iranian military this is an Iranian soldier who is switching sides, but he's got to be careful. So he covers his face. But take a look at this message holding up a picture of President Trump.
جناب رئیس جمهور آمریکا، آقای ترامپ، ما ارتشی‌ها و تمام مردم ایران منتظریم که ما رو نجات بدید و از شر این رژیم ظالم رها کنید تا بتونیم ایران رو از نو بسازیم و همونطوری که راجع به آمریکا میگی ما هم می‌خواهیم که بگیم to make Iran great again.
Nice touch there, kissing the picture of President Trump at the end of it. Look, bottom line is the protests continue. Protesters continue to be killed. President Trump was hedging on what numbers to believe, and I understand why he has to do that. Anything that he admits to knowing or admits to to accepting as fact, he needs to act on. So he has to be very careful about what he says that he knows and what he says that he's heard. But everything's coming to a head. And I think that this is, as I said at the very beginning of this video, this is a historical moment of truth. President Trump is being strongly pressured by, I wouldn't call them isolationists because that's not entirely where this is coming from. They're also pro-Arab, pro-Islam. There are forces within the Trump administration who are very cozy. They're in business with the Qataris. You notice that the Trump administration has been developing these and working with these close working relationships with Qatar and Turkey. I've written about this. I've made videos about this. I think it is the greatest blind spot that this administration has, that it behaves as though Qatar and Turkey specifically, but Saudi Arabia, tends to waffle, but that Qatar and Turkey specifically are moderate forces and moderate states who are actually the key to stability, which is in fact just the opposite. Qatar and Turkey are the backbone, both financially and in terms of muscle and power and numbers. They're the backbone of the Muslim Brotherhood and the spread of Islamism across the Middle East. That's really what Qatar and Turkey are. And the fact that the Trump administration sees them as credible partners, some of this is also tactical. They don't want them to fall further into the hands of the Russians or the Chinese Communist Party. Turkey's a NATO ally. There's a lot of calculations there. But that said, both in Syria, where the Trump administration is backing the Turkish-backed al-Julani Sunni jihadist who's taken over, and that's pitted the Americans against the minorities like the Christians and the Druze and the Kurds. And that's created a bit of a tension there. The same tension is playing out now with Iran, where Trump has committed to do the right thing, to protect the protester, to support freedom, to bring down, essentially, to combat this evil regime. And here's Qatar and the Turks and the Saudis joining in with them, who are trying to scuttle that action and protect the Iranian regime. And there are people in the White House, people around President Trump, people close to President Trump, who are pressuring him not to take action. Meanwhile, at the same time, he made these ultimatums. He hasn't verbally backed down from them yet. And you have the Crown Prince echoing them and people in Iran hearing them and being inspired by them. So this is like, watching a car accident in slow motion. Things are coming to a head, and we are going to have some sort of confrontation where all eyes, again, are on President Trump. There is a historic decision. When I say historic, we are now talking about a decision that maybe once in a century or once in a half century are there decisions this big in history that are coming. And one of them is coming right now, and the entire world is waiting to see what President Trump will do.